Certain things are only meant to happen once in a century, like the 100-year flood or the 100-year pandemic. While we find ourselves in the midst of a truly novel situation, it is a good time to reflect upon other events that happen very infrequently. Today we're looking at things that will happen only once in a lifetime. There have only been 2 men cured of HIV in the history of the world. The first one, Timothy Ray Brown, is simply referred to as the Berlin patient. In 2006, after living with the virus for 11 years and controlling his infection with antiretroviral drugs, he learned that he had developed acute myeloid leukemia. Chemotherapy failed, and the next year, Brown, an American then living in Berlin, received the first of 2 bone marrow transplants, a common treatment for this cancer, and ditched his ARVs. When HIV-infected people stop taking ARVs, levels of HIV typically skyrocket within weeks. Yet researchers scouring Brown's blood over the past 7 years have found only traces of the viral genetic material, none of which can replicate. The second is known as the London patient. His name is Adam Castillejo, age 40. Born in Venezuela, he has lived in London for nearly 20 years. The announcement of Mr. Castillejo's cure last year electrified the scientific community and energized the pursuit of strategies for curing HIV. Mr. Castillejo was found to have HIV in 2003 when he was just 23. In the 1980s and 90s, a diagnosis of HIV was seen as a death sentence, and that is how Mr. Castillejo received the news. It was a very terrifying and traumatic experience to go through, he said. Frane Salak is either the luckiest person in history or the unluckiest, depending on your perspective. Over the course of several decades, he had 7 different brushes with death, but walked away unscathed each time. Then, just to prove that he truly was exceptional, Frane won the lottery in 2003. Though his life has been filled with extreme highs and lows, the 89-year-old music teacher chooses to remain positive, giving himself the moniker the luckiest person ever to live. Salak's brushes with death started in January 1962 when he was riding a train through a cold, rainy canyon, and the train flipped off the tracks and crashed into a river. Someone pulled Salak to safety, while 17 other unfortunate passengers drowned. Salak suffered a broken arm and hypothermia. The next year, during his first and only plane ride, he was blown out of a malfunctioning plane door and landed in a haystack. The plane crashed, killing 19 people. 3 years after that, in 1966, a bus that he was riding in skidded off the road and into a river, drowning 4 passengers. Salak swam to shore with a few cuts and bruises. In 1970, his car caught fire as he was driving, and he managed to escape before the fuel tank blew up. 3 years later, in another driving incident, the engine of his car was doused with hot oil from a malfunctioning fuel pump, causing flames to shoot through the air vents. Salak's hair was completely singed in this incident, but he was otherwise unharmed. In 1995, he was struck by a bus in Zagreb, but sustained only minor injuries. In 1996, he eluded a head-on collision with a United Nations truck on a mountain curve by swerving into a guardrail, which gave way under the force of his car. He was ejected from the car when the door flew open, managed to hold onto a tree, and watched his car plummet down 90 meters into a gorge. In 1848, a unique spectacle occurred which some people consider to be a harbinger of the end of the world. The water ceased to flow over the Horseshoe Falls. After an exceptionally cold winter, the thick ice on Lake Erie had begun to break up during a warm spell in March. On March 28th and 29th, strong easterly winds drove huge amounts of ice across Lake Erie. The swift current then drew the ice into the mouth of the Niagara River, where it began to pile up. Reinforced by cold winds, the ice formed a dam between Buffalo and Fort Erie, cutting off the flow of water into the river and over the falls for a period of 30 hours. With the falls dry for the first time in millennia, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began an investigation. As engineers bored into the riverbed to map and probe the stresses, faults, and pressures of the rock, excited tourists scampered across the dry expanse, collecting coins thrown into the water decades ago. Pictures of 2 bullets, which bizarrely collided in mid-air, have caused quite a bit of excitement. There's been myriad assertions as to why and how this happened. One popular assertion is that somehow fate intervened to save the lives of 2 combatants. At first glance, the picture is fascinating, both bullets appearing to have been welded together. However, upon closer inspection and analysis by some critics, it has been suggested that the round on the left bullet does not have any rifling on it at all. Thus, the veracity of the photo has been challenged, but some people claim that the bullets collided into one another at the Battle of Gallipoli in modern-day Turkey. A man who was swept over the Canadian side of Niagara Falls in 2014 survived the plunge with non-life-threatening injuries, police say. Niagara Parks police were called to the edge of the falls at 4 a.m. amid reports of a man in crisis at the brink of the water. The man climbed a retaining wall after officers arrived, and he dropped into the rushing waters above the Horseshoe Falls. Rescue teams searched the basin below and eventually came upon the man sitting on rocks near the Journey Behind the Falls observation platform. The man was transported to the hospital for further care. Niagara Falls is notoriously deadly and has proven fatal to many who have tried to survive a plunge over the falls. The rapids above the Horseshoe Falls can reach speeds of up to 40 kilometers an hour before sweeping objects or people over a 57-meter plunge into the deep basin below. The whirlpool rapids below the falls can be just as deadly, with speeds of up to 48 kilometers an hour. The incident occurred on the 59th anniversary of 7-year-old Roger Woodward surviving a fall from Horseshoe Falls with only a life jacket on. With his sister and a family friend, Woodward was involved in a boating accident just upstream from the falls on July 9, 1960, and he was swept over. After losing her engagement ring on her family farm more than a decade ago, Canadian Mary Grams resigned herself to the idea that she would never see it again. That is, until the diamond ring showed up, 13 years after she lost it, wrapped tightly around a misshapen carrot that had been freshly plucked from the garden. The 84-year-old said she likely lost the ring as she was pulling a large weed from her farm in central Alberta in 2004, prompting a frantic search. "We looked high and low on our hands and knees. We couldn't find it. I thought for sure either they rototilled it or something happened to it," she told the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. "I cried so many times. When she washed off the carrot, she found the gem. Her husband quickly figured out it must be his mother's." Daly said it was so weird how the carrot had grown perfectly through the ring. "This is not the first time someone has found a diamond ring on a carrot," the BBC notes. In 2011, a Swedish woman dug up her lost wedding ring, snug around the top of a carrot, after it went missing in her kitchen 16 years previously, and apparently got tossed out with vegetable scraps. Some rare and interesting weather phenomena make headlines that are both terrifying and awe-inspiring. On April 22, 2015, when Chile's Calbuco volcano erupted, a massive cloud of gas and ash billowed over 40,000 feet into the air. And while the main attraction was the volcanic blast, scientists began paying attention to the rare and unusual phenomenon known as a dirty thunderstorm that was occurring, complete with bolts of lightning crackling in and around the ash plume. This volcanic lightning event is only caused by large eruptions. Similar events happened with the eruptions of the Sakurajima volcano in southern Japan and a volcano in southern Iceland back in 2010. Comet West was a comet described as one of the brightest objects to pass through the inner solar system in 1976. It is often described as a great comet. After the discovery, Brian Marsden, based on other observations of the comet, calculated that it would pass closest to the Sun on February 24, 1976, and be visible from Earth in March with a magnitude of around 5. This was, of course, only 3 months after Comet West was first spotted. If Comet West happened to be on a collision course with Earth, we would have had little time to prepare. It turned out that Comet West was much more spectacular than Marsden first predicted. The comet reached a brightness of -3 during its closest approach to the Sun, which made it brighter than Venus in the morning sky. Comet West was one of the brightest comets in the 20th century, and one of the brightest comets in history. It was also among a handful of comets that had been observed breaking into pieces. This fragmentation occurred when the comet divided into 2 pieces, and 2 additional fragments were created. Fraternal twins can look as similar or dissimilar as any other siblings, from features to size and height to hair color. So when they're born with different skin tones, it's not really a big deal, or at least it shouldn't be. But somehow, thanks to the often confusing topic of racial identity, stories like People magazine's biracial twins born in Illinois, it's so rare, still make headlines. It states twins in Quincy, Illinois are garnering attention, and not just because they are super adorable. 9-month-old Kalani inherited her mother Whitney Meyer's lighter complexion, while twin sister Jirani got her darker complexion from her father Thomas Dean. Meyer is Caucasian, while Dean is African American. The article goes on to suggest that one twin is black and the other is white. It doesn't exactly spell that out, but the very fact that it's featured in a magazine along with their mother's exclamation, "Sure enough, they're biracial twins," suggests that these twins are so rare because their complexions are different enough that they belong to different racial groups. In fact, this phenomenon is not unheard of. What's scarier than a tornado? How about a tornado made of fire? On July 26, 2018, the so-called Carr Fire outside Redding, California, spawned the strongest tornado in state history. A fire tornado, or fire-nado. This rare and terrifying phenomenon was only the second true fire tornado in recorded history, and the first witnessed in the United States. Wildfires have become an all-too-common phenomenon in California. The region's low humidity and scarce rainfall make it an environment ripe for blazes. In fact, much of the state should burn naturally every 50 to 100 years or so. An occasional fire can even help the ecosystem. It's a way for nature to restore nutrients to the soil while cleansing the landscape of an overgrowth of moisture-robbing vegetation. But people have been building homes in these regions. On the morning of September 1, 1859, amateur astronomer Richard Carrington ascended into the private observatory attached to his country estate outside of London. After cranking open the dome shutter to reveal the clear blue sky, he pointed his brass telescope toward the sun and began to sketch a cluster of enormous dark spots that freckled its surface. Suddenly, Carrington spotted what he described as two patches of intensely bright and white light erupting from the sunspots. 5 minutes later, the fireballs vanished, but within hours their impact would be felt across the globe. That night, telegraph communications around the world began to fail. There were reports of sparks showering from telegraph machines, shocking operators and setting papers ablaze. All over the planet, colorful auroras illuminated the nighttime skies, glowing so brightly that birds began to chirp, and laborers started their daily chores, believing the sun had begun rising.